And today we are going to talk about action recognition. And UCF CRCV specifically, this research group is a well-known research center for this topic, action recognition. And so this will be the outline for today's lecture. We will briefly talk about what action recognition is and what are the related problems in video domain. Then we will try to cover three different deep neural architectures which can be used for performing action recognition. So we'll cover C3D, I3D, and 2+1D. And then we will briefly try to cover a different kind of architecture. It's different from what we have seen so far. It's called recurrent neural network. So we will briefly talk about the intuition behind why we need a recurrent neural network, and then later how we can use this for action recognition. Okay. So video, as you all know, it's like a sequence of frames. And usually, like when you capture videos these days, you have 30 frames per second. Earlier, we used to have like a very like not that higher frame rate. So we used to have maybe 20 or 25 frames per second. But these days, I think this is the standard. And if you think about this, since your videos is a sequence of images, then whatever approach you have to solve the problem in image domain, one way will be to use the same approach on individual frames of this video, and later maybe have a aggregation technique or maybe a assimilation technique where you combine results from all those frames and make some assumptions or make some predictions about the video. Okay. Now let's see what action recognition is. So the idea is, given a video, and that will be like sequence of frames, you have to detect what kind of action is being performed in this video. Okay. So for example, in this case, you can see that a girl is like playing in this swing, and you can say that swing is the action. Okay. So given this video, then you'll have to predict what's going on. And similar to your image classification, you have different categories of different objects, right? And you do object classification. Similarly, you will have some set of categories for your actions, and you will have to perform video classification. So in a way, the problem is same as image classification. The only difference is, in case of image classification, your input was an image, and in case of action recognition, your input is a video. But apart from that, I think if you think conceptually, both problems are identical. You are basically solving a classification task. Okay. Now, there can be different variations of action recognition. For example, in this case, if this is let's say a still frame from a video, and you have to identify what activity is happening, here you can see that, for example, if we are looking into the activity of biking, so you can see that there are multiple instances of biking, right? So instead of just one instance, you can have multiple person performing the same action. And that's similar to your multiple instance classification or maybe multi-level recognition in images. So that's the analogy. Then instead of multiple instances, you could have multiple actions being performed in the same video frame. So this is a sample example here. You can see that, for example, this person is like maybe raising his hand if or the action category is actually hand waving. If this person is hand waving, and this person here is like hand clapping. So these are two different actions, but both the actions are being performed at the same time. So if you will play this video, then you'll have to recognize or classify like both these actions at the same time. And again, this is similar to your multi-level classification in images. Okay. Another interesting variation of action recognition is, what if you have a trimmed or an untrimmed video? So let me try to explain what a trimmed and untrimmed video is. So let's say you have a video and it has 30 frames, right? And from the first frame until the last frame, some action is being performed. All right. So that's called a trimmed video. It means that you don't have any background frames in that video. In all the frames which are present, that action is being performed. Now, why that is important? This is important because when you have to classify what action is being performed in this video, you just take that trimmed video and classify it. All right, so that's the trimmed case, the first one. The second category is untrimmed version, where what will happen is you might not see the action being performed in all the frames. For example, in this particular sample, if let's say the action category is skiing, then you can see that all the frames before this frame, you don't see that action. The action is only present in frames which are present at this location, right? And all the future frames also doesn't have that action. So that's called the untrimmed scenario. And this is special because you cannot take like this long untrimmed video and say that this action is being performed, because there are many sections or many segments in the video where that action was not present. And this is a special case of action recognition. We call this temporal action localization. And the goal here is first to identify which action is being performed, all right? And then also temporally locate where exactly that action was being performed. So you'll have to predict the start frame when the action starts and the end frame when the action ends. And then the rest of the frames will be just the background frames. So that's called temporal action localization. And so this is the right term to use. And I think in research community, people have tried to twist this. Sometimes they also use like the term action detection for this problem, which is not the right term. Okay. Now let's talk about action detection. Now action detection is you have to spatiotemporally localize where the action is being performed. So in the previous case, this was just temporal action localization. You just need the start and end frame. But in action detection, which is spatiotemporal localization, you also need to exactly tell where the action is being performed in the spatial region. Okay, so that's the big difference. Now, again, this action detection can have two different variations. It can have trimmed version and it can have untrimmed version. Now, in the trimmed version, again, in all the frames, this action will be performed. So what you have to do is then you have to classify all the frames as some action category, right? And then you also have to detect like some kind of bounding box where that action was being performed. Now, this is the trimmed case. In the untrimmed case, again, similar to your temporal action localization, you'll have regions where no action is being performed and region where actions will be performed. So the difference is in this case, you just predict the start frame, the end frame, but in action detection, what you will do is you will also predict a bounding box around the actor. All right, so that's a big difference between temporal action localization and action detection. And these are some sample videos showing like spatiotemporal localization. So this is like diving action. These are sequence of frames from a video. And again, this is biking action. These are sequence of frames again from another video. Okay. Now, similar to action classification in action detection, what can happen is there might be multiple activities happening in the same time step in the same frame. Then what you have to do is you have to detect all those actions. They might be happening, they might be co-occurring with each other. Okay. So this again is showing some sample videos from a very famous action recognition dataset, which is called UCF 101. So this was created here at UCF CRCV lab. And this is being used by all the world, whoever is working on this action recognition problem. So in this data set, we have roughly around 13,000 videos. And it's not that big because I think it was created around 2013 or 2012, around that time. And it's 101 because we have 101 action classes in this data set. So there are two different variations of UCF 101. The first is for action recognition, where you have around 13,000 video samples and 101 action classes. Another subset of this dataset is called UCF101-24. What that means is 24 classes among these 101 are also available for action detection. So what we have done is we have provided like annotations for all the actions so that they can be used for action detection. So there are two different variants, one for recognition where you have 101 classes, the other variant where you have 24 classes, which can be used for action detection. Now, after that, I think there are many other data sets which have been released. For classification, I think there is a long list. We have kinetics, which is, I think, the largest. There are, I think, recently they updated the number of classes and they have, I think, 700 or 800 classes, which is a lot. And they have around more than 500,000 videos. And for classification, there is something, and there are a couple of others. But for detection, there are not like a lot of data sets available, and the reason is you need these bounding boxes for each and every frame in your videos. And one of a recent data set is called VIRAT. Actually, this is a very old data set. It was released in 2011. But what has been recently done is now we have annotations for all the activities in the video frames. And again, so it's the same data set VIRAT, and it can be used for action detection. And it's a very complex data set. It includes everything. It includes activity detection. You can have multiple actors in the same frame. All right. It has like untrimmed as well as trimmed variation, which means that you might have a very long video and you will have regions where there is no activity happening. So in a sense, this is a holistic data set where you can have all the variants you can think of for the task of action detection, action recognition. Okay. By the way, these are the results using one of the recent methods which we have developed. And this is kind of detecting all these activities and also localizing. These are not ground truths. So these are the estimated localizations. Okay, so those were regarding activities. Other interesting problem in videos which we can solve is video segmentation. It's similar to image segmentation. So in image, you have to just segment a single image. In video, you have to segment like a sequence of images. And if you think about this, segmenting objects in videos is a bit easier when you compare this with images, because you have the motion information, how your objects are moving across frames. So that information kind of helps how you can do the segmentation. And again, there are different variations how you want to solve this problem. Sometimes what they do is you are given like the segmented objects for the first frame, and you just have to track them across time. And what is being shown here. So the first frame annotations were provided, and then the objects are being tracked or being segmented in the subsequent frames. The other variation could be you are not given any kind of initial segmentation, and all you have to do is uh, blindly perform image segmentation depending upon what objects you can find in these videos. Now, being said that, it's easier to track, but again, if you think about this, it's a very challenging problem because in images, you just have to segment a single image. And in this case, since you have sequence of frames, so there are many other restrictions which will apply. For example, if you have to train your network, then there will be restrictions like you cannot develop like a very huge network due to memory requirements. And because you'll have to fit like all the sequence of frames in your memory while training, then that will limit your batch size, and also that will limit like what resolution you can use for your videos. So there are many challenges which make these tasks very difficult. Okay, so those were like all the different variations of problems which we can solve in videos. Now let's talk about three different architectures which were initially proposed to solve the task of video classification, and which can be action recognition as well. And now they are also used for extracting features from the videos. Okay, so the idea here is once you have these networks trained, then if you apply these networks on any new videos, then they can give you very interesting features which you can use for like many different problems. It doesn't have to be just action classification or video classification. Okay, so let's go through each of these networks one by one. We will start with C3D. I think this was the first deep architecture which was proposed for video classification, one of the first architecture. And the idea is very simple. What they did is you take a 2D CNN architecture, and instead of performing 2D convolution, what you will do is you will perform 3D convolution. All right. So the difference is in 2D convolution, you have ideally you have a 3D filter, right? Because it will have height, width, and it will also have the depth. So I mean, you're performing 2D convolution, but your kernel is actually 3D. So in 3D convolution, effectively your kernel will be 4-dimensional. You will have height, width, and you will also have a temporal extent. And then you also have the depth information, right? So it will be a 4D kernel, but we call it 3D convolution. And then what you do is, as you perform convolution or the correlation, like in spatial region, you perform the same type of correlation in the 3D environment, right? So you scan in your XY region, right? You slide your kernel, and you also slide that kernel in the temporal region. So that's the only difference. Now, the architecture they proposed, this is like I think their architecture, they have 8 convolution layers. The numbers here are showing like the number of channels they have in each layer, and these intermediate layers are pooling operations. And again, same as you can perform pooling in 2D, 2 dimension, you can also perform pooling in 3 dimension. It's just you have one extra dimension. Okay, rest of the things will not change. So they have 5 max pooling layers, and at the end they have 2 fully connected layers where they have these many neurons. So if you think about this, this is almost identical to your LXNet architecture, right? The only difference I think will be there we had 6 or 7 conlayers instead of 8. Here we have 8. So other than that, it's almost similar. The other difference is instead of 2D convolution, you're performing 3D convolution. Otherwise, the structure is almost similar. At the end here, when you're performing 2D convolution, the shape of the features, if it's not completely flattened, will be like, let's say for LXNet, it was 7 cross 7 cross 512, right? Then you have to flatten those features to add like a fully connected layer. In this case, what will happen is you might have, let's say 7 cross 7, and then you will have additional dimension in temporal domain. It could be 2 or 4, depending upon like how much pooling you're performing in these layers. And then again, you can do flattening. So instead of flattening of 3-dimensional feature vector, you are performing flattening of 4-dimensional feature vector. And then you can have the same fully connected layers. And at then you have a softmax and you perform classification. All right, so it's very simple. If you have any questions, just let me know. So that was architecture number 1. Now the next architecture we are going to talk about is I3D. It's very popular. I think it was proposed in 2017, and it's still being used a lot in many different problems. And the idea here is simple. What they did is they took Inception V1 network, which we discussed when we were talking about convolution neural network, and they simply changed the kernel size from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional. Okay, so this is the exact same architecture which you have seen for Inception V1, which is used for image classification, right? So in image classification, your kernel shape was 7 cross 7. Here they have 7 cross 7 cross 7. And again, if you look at max pooling, there you had max pooling of 3 cross 3. Here you have max pooling of 1 cross 3 cross 3. So effectively, when you're not performing any pooling in the temporal dimension, the first one is representing the temporal extent. Okay. And the rest of the layers are same. It's just converting 2D filters to 3D filters. And again, if you look at these inception blocks, which is same as what they have in a 2-dimensional variant. So this inception block is shown over here. It's the same thing. What you do is you used kernels of like a different of different spatial extent. So this is 1 cross 1 cross 1 kernel. Then you have two parallel 3 cross 3 cross 3 kernels. So you just extend your 2D kernels to 3D kernels. All right, that's the only change. And the rest of the network is same. Again, at the end, you have a convolution operation instead of a fully connected layer, which will make the predictions. And that's the I3D network. Now, one interesting experiment they did is, so we have talked about optical flow, right? And we discussed how optical flow can be very useful for performing features from the videos. So it has been shown that optical flow is also useful for action recognition. And what they did is, instead of using RGB video as input to the first layer, they computed the optical flow of that video. And you know how to compute the optical flow. We discussed that in the last lecture. And instead of RGB, they used optical flow and used the same network. And it turns out the classification performance using optical flow is much better than the RGB video itself. The other interesting experiment they did is they tried to combine both RGB as well as optical flow and see like if they can further improve the performance. And it was found that both RGB and optical flow are kind of giving you complementary information, which is intuitive as well, because optical flow is only telling you how the objects are moving in your video, right? And kind of that's sufficient to determine what action is being performed. But optical flow estimation, it's not accurate all the time. So let's think about like what additional information is RGB video giving you, which is not present in optical flow. So if you think about like the appearance information, so what's the color of the object? What's the color of the background? So all those appearance, what's the texture of the object? So those details are not present in the optical flow data modality, right? So that information can be supplemented by using an RGB video, and that's what happened here. So if you combine the RGB with optical flow, the performance of action recognition was further improved. And there can be different ways to do that. Uh, a simple approach could be you just take a sequence of frames, your RGB frames, okay, and use a 3D coordinate. And this could be your 3D C3D network or I3D network. You make the predictions, and again you compute optical flow from this video. All right. So for each pair of frames, you will have some optical flow. So again, you will have series of frames for these optical flow. So that will be your input to again the same network. You can train this end to end and you can make predictions. And at the end, you can actually average those predictions to refine your results. All right. So that's one simple way. The other variants could be, instead of merging like at a prediction level, you can also try to merge at feature level and then train these two networks jointly. So that's another variant, and that also works fine. All right. So that was about I3D, and this is more recent. I think it was done in 2019, and it's pretty interesting. So what they are trying to do is, first of all, the backbone they used is from ResNet network, right, where you have skip connections, which improves in backpropagation of your gradients. So the 2D version of ResNet architecture, it can be extended to 3D, as we just discussed, like how we can extend our inception network to 3D to make I3D. Now, once you have that ResNet 3D variant, what we have here is, instead of applying 3D kernels, what we can do is we can first try to apply a 2D kernel, which stands for this 2, which will be like finding the correlation in spatial domain. And then you can do is apply a 1D kernel, which will be learning the correlation in temporal extent. So it's kind of decoupling your spatial correlation with your temporal correlation. And this idea works very well. And it actually gives a very good improvement over your 3D convolution variant. All right, so here's the idea. If you have a feature map of T cross D cross D, so T is the temporal dimension, these two are the spatial dimension. You can directly use a 3D convolution, right? So that convolution will be applied at the same time in all the 3 dimensions. Now, what we can do is we can break down this operation into 2 steps. The first step is we will apply the 2D kernel and only learn the correlation in the spatial dimensions. So we just make this temporal dimension 1, which means that you're not learning any correlation across frames. You're just looking into the center frame where you're applying this kernel. So that's the correlation in the spatial domain. And once you have done that, what you do is you learn the temporal correlation. So in this case, an easy hack is you can just make the spatial kernel shape 1 cross 1, which means that it will only look into 1 pixel at a time. So it's not learning any spatial correlation. And T is the number of frames which you're using to learn the temporal correlation. Now you can break down this T cross D cross D kernel into 2 such kernels. And so one benefit is the performance. Now, if you think about this, this has another benefit. So in this case, if you think about when you're performing this operation, so the number of weights you require for this kernel will be T times D, right? You just have to multiply all these 3 dimensions. But if you compute the number of parameters you require for this particular operation, where you are decoupling your temporal and spatial correlation, so that's D cross D, that many weights in your first kernel, and T weights in your second kernel. So the total number of parameters is D cross D plus T, which is far less than the number of parameters you require for this 3D convolution kernel. So that's one of the reasons why it performs well, because you have fewer parameters as compared to this, and which can like implicitly avoid overfitting and only learn meaningful features. So that was the benefit, but there is one issue here, and the issue is it's fine that this kind of operation is reducing your number of parameters. So which doesn't mean your memory consumption is going down, right? So this is kind of increasing your memory consumption. So if you think about this, in this case, if you have an input feature map, all right, it will have certain shape, and you apply this 3D kernel on that shape. So these many parameters, it's fine. It's not a big number, but after applying convolution, again, you will get some feature map. So if you think about memory consumption, these parameters are not the one which are actually taking a lot of memory in your GPU. The GPU memory is being used by these feature maps, because these will be huge, right? These kernels will be pretty small when you compare those with the activation maps. Now, what's happening in case of this 2+1 deconvolution kernel? So you will have again the same feature map. You apply this kernel, so you will again get some kind of feature map, right? On top of which you will apply this kernel, and then you again get the same set of feature map. So this feature map, intermediate feature map, which you get after applying this kernel, is like is going to take additional memory in your GPU. And that's the reason why this variant of this resonant architecture takes more memory when you train it. So even though it's taking less parameters, all right? So this means that it's not always how big your network is or how many parameters you have in your network. The memory consumption also depends on other factors. All right, so this is like one simple architecture showing this 2+1D convolution kernel. You have the input clip. This is just series of these convolution operations, and at the end you have this fully connected layer which you can use for classification. Okay. Now these are the 3 variants for action recognition or video classification. They are also used for extracting features from videos. And these 3 are different, and these are not the only ones. There are many other variants as well, but these are kind of representative, because this is like the vanilla architecture which you can have using 3D convolution. This is like trying to introduce the idea of inception block where you have multiple kernels at the same time, so trying to learn different set of features. And this is another variation where you are breaking down your 3D convolution into 2D and 1D convolution. So most of the other variants you will see, like it will be maybe combination of these. And of course, I mean, there could be some new ideas as well. but these are the main architectures I think which you should know if you are looking into video understanding. Now let's look into some of the practical aspects of using these pre-trained networks. Now, since these networks have large number of parameters, so as we have talked about earlier as well, we need large data sets to train these. And what we usually do is we use like existing data sets like ImageNet, Kinetic Sports 1 million and YouTube 8 million to pre-train this. And then on the target data set, which could be much smaller, for example, UCF 101, which has only 13,000 videos, we use the weights which we have learned on these data sets and fine tune on UCF 101. So that actually gives you a very strong boost in terms of performance. So just to give you an idea, if you train your I3D network on UCF 101, I think the best accuracy you can get is around 42 or 43%. All right. But if you pre-train your I3D network on, let's say, Kinetics or ImageNet, then that same performance can be boosted to, I think, up to 83 or 84%. So that's like 40% jump. So pre-training helps a lot. And usually the standard way to do that is you pre-train your network on these datasets and fine-tune on the target dataset. Now, one question which usually students have is, I3D is like a data is a network which you have designed for videos, but ImageNet is a dataset where we only have images. So how can we use a network which was pre-trained on ImageNet and then fine-tune on video data? So there are two different ways which we can use to do that. The first is what you can do is you can take your images from ImageNet and create a boring video. So just repeat the same image maybe to 16 frames or 32 frames and use that as a video and train your network, I3D or any other network. And then those will be like some meaningful weights. And if you use those, they will show you like some improvement in your target data. So that's one way. The other way is what you can do is if you train your, let's say, inception network for images for image classification on ImageNet. Now, if you think about this, when you're creating that boring video and training your I3D network, then effectively mean you're not changing your pixel values across time, right? So whatever kernels you are learning using images, if you just replicate those kernels in the third dimension, then it will be conceptually equivalent to training another network on the boring video. So what we can do is we can just take the 2D CNN which we have trained on ImageNet and take those kernels. If let's say those are 3x3 kernels, we extend them to 3x3x3 kernel and just repeat those values across the temporal domain. So that's another way. Okay, so now let's see what are the different variants in terms of network architecture which can be used for video classification or maybe action recognition. All right, so this is something called LSTM. This is a long short-term memory. We will talk about this today. And this is a recurrent network. And the idea here is you take your sequence of images and at each time step, you pass your image to a coordinate to extract the features and send those features to this LSTM. And you do that like in the temporal extent repetitively in a recurrent way. And at the end, this recurrent network will give you the action class. So that's one variant. So don't worry about this. We are going to talk about this in detail. The second variant is using 3D coordinates. This is we just discussed. So you take your sequence of frames, which you can call like maybe a short video clip, and pass this video clip to a 3D convolution network, and that network will recognize the action. Now, other variant could be you can try to combine optical flow with your visual data. And like we saw, like in I3D, they used RGB video frames and optical flow for those. But what we can do is instead of sending in like the full RGB video, we can just use single image. Because if you think about this, all the appearance information you have in one frame, that's kind of repetitive in all the frames in the video. So that's the intuition here. You just use a 2D convolution, extract the features from the images. So this is giving you appearance features. And for extracting the motion, you compute the optical flow. And again, optical flow, you flow to your convolution network and then perform action classification. All right. So that's another variant. This is an extension of the same network. Now this was done for single image, but what you can do is you can do this repetitively for all the consecutive frames in your video. And that's what is being shown here. So you have multiple of these for each of the frames in your video. And after extracting those features, you can pass those features to your 3D coordinate to perform action recognition. So just another variant of this. And this is like a two-stream standard 3D con network. This we discussed earlier, where you have sequence of images for appearance, use a 3D convolution network, and optical flow from the same video, use 3D coordinate, average those out, make the prediction. So these are different variants which can be used for performing video classification or let's say action recognition. All right. Now let's talk about what this recurrent network is. Now, image was your, it doesn't have any sequence, right? When you talk about images, it's just an image. You can see the image at once. You don't have to wait for it like to look at the full image. But if you think about video, then video is a sequence of frames. So you have an extra dimension. So you watch one frame at a time and you keep watching it, and that will be your video. So it's essentially a sequence, and recurrent neural networks are used to process such sequential data. So text is one kind of sequential data. For example, this particular sentence. So you can't look at the whole sentence at once. You will start from the left, right? You will look at this word, it is fun, and then you will go on. So it has some kind of sequence. And this is like the same sequence which you will see in videos. So instead of words, you will have sequence of frames. So some other example for sequential data is audio. Again, you have the sequence. For each time step, you will have some kind of that value which represents this audio signal. Okay, and again for video, it's a sequential data because you have the sequence of frames. Now, if you compare this recurrent network with your standard CNN, in standard CNN, you have this image which your network can see at once and make the prediction. But in recurrent neural network, what happens is your network will look at each time step one time at a time. Okay, so it's looking at, let's say if you're working in videos, which is a sequential data, so it will look at this one frame at a time and make some prediction. Okay, so this is your network green, and this pink one is the prediction. For example, if it's let's say it's doing action detection, localizing where the action is happening. So it's looking at this image, doing some processing, and again, this processing could be anything. It could be a fully connected layer. It could be a convolutional neural network, right? It's a network in itself. So it will process this image, make some prediction. For example, it's trying to localize where the action is happening. And based on whatever computation it did, it will pass some information to the future processing unit. And again, this unit will again take this next frame, process it, make some prediction, and for example, localize in this case. And this will keep on happening. Okay. So the processing of frames is happening like, it's not happening at once, it's happening in sequence. So that's the basic idea behind recurrent neural network. So let's talk about like a vanilla recurrent neural network, how it works. So essentially what you have is you have an input which will have a sequence, and then you have a network kind of thing, and that network you will use again and again. So for each time step, you're going to use the same network. So it will do some processing. We will come to that, what kind of processing it can do. But the conceptual idea is it will take input in form of a sequence and keep processing them one step at a time. So that's the whole recurrent neural network. And if you try to unfold that across time, this is something which you will get. Okay. And here you can see that you have broken down like this input into different sequences, xt minus 1, xt plus 1, and this could be a longer sequence as well. In this case, we are only showing like 3 time steps. And again, this is the same network. We are just showing it separately for each time step. So what it will do is it will take input at this time step, do some processing, and make some predictions. So apart from the input, it will also take like some input from the previous time step. Okay, so that's what's happening here. It is taking input from the previous time step, the current input, make some prediction. All right. So that's the general structure of RNN architecture. So that's the idea. It processes sequences. It takes feedback from the previous time step. That's what we saw last time. And so you have an input. That's the processing unit. This arrow is showing like the repetitive process, and that's the output. And again, that's the unrolled version. Same thing, which we discussed in the previous slide. Now, there can be different variants in a recurrent neural network. Now, the vanilla neural network, it is just one-to-one mapping, and this can be same as your standard CNN architectures. You take the input, do some processing, make some prediction. All right. There could be one-to-many mapping. So you just take one time step as input, but you process in sequence, but you are making multiple predictions. So one good example of this kind of problem is, let's say you have an image and you want to generate some caption for that image, right? So the input is the image, just one time step, and this recurrent neural network is trying to generate the caption because the caption will be a long sentence. It will have multiple words. So what it's doing is it's trying to generate one word at a time. So that's an example of one to many. Now you can have many to one mapping, and a good example of this could be video action classification. So for a video, you have sequence of frames, that's your input, right? And again, you're recurrently processing those. And at the end, you just want one prediction, the action label of that video. The other variant is many to many. So again, you have a sequence of input, series of input, and you're also predicting a series of output. And this is like the recurrent structure. And a good example is machine translation. It could be like sequence of words to sequence of words. For example, if you have something written in English and you want to translate that to Spanish. So that's like a machine translation, sequence of words to sequence of words. And the reason you have like input at these time steps, but you only start predicting from this time step is because for machine translation or any such task, you first need to look at the complete sentence to make any sense and then start predicting. Okay, so that's the only reason why you have this kind of structure. Now, this is a normal vanilla recurrent neural architecture where you have many to many mapping. So your input is a sequence of frames and your output is also a sequence of something. So again, one good example could be, again, a video classification or action recognition. But in this case, what you're doing is you are making prediction for each frame independently. So for each frame, you will tell which action is happening. Okay. Now, before diving into the detailed structure of this recurrent neural network or LSTM, let's do a quick recap of all the activation functions which we will need. So activation function, what they do is given activation from your previous layer, which is coming out of your convolution operation or any other operation, what you try to do is you try to normalize that value. So, and depending upon which activation function you are using, your normalized values will be different. So if you're using a sigmoid activation, what it does is, so that's the formula, it will make the values between 0 and 1. Okay, so whatever your input values or input activations are, your output is always going to be between 0 and 1. Similarly, for 10-inch, the values will be between -1 and +1. All right, so just keep that in mind. And for ReLU, all the negative values will be trimmed. They will be removed, and you will just keep the positive value. So you're not changing your activation at all if it's a positive number. All right. So a simple vanilla RNN could be that processing unit. You can just have an activation function in between and nothing else. So then what's happening at each time step, you will have some input. Okay, let's say at this time step, you have this input and this is coming from the previous time step. You can concat those and then apply this 10h operation, just normalize those values. And that will be output at this time step. And that will also be the feedback to the next time step. So this is a very simple recurrent structure. I mean, it's not doing any processing, but it's showing you what a recurrent structure is. Okay, it's just activation function. Now let's try to make this more complicated. And let's talk about LSTMs, long short-term memories. So the idea here is, so this you can see that it's more complicated. It's not just activation. You're doing something here. So let's talk about what exactly is being done here. And again, so LSTMs are useful, but there are many more powerful cells which have been derived from this. And so this is the basic. If you understand this, you can also modify this and to suit your problem domain. You will find this very beneficial. All right, so let's try to understand each of these components. So basically, there are three main components. Okay, first, I think we have a forget gate layer. So this first part here. Then I think we have input gate layer, that in the center. And finally, we'll have an output gate layer, which is on the right. So let's see like what all of these components are and how actually they are performing these forgetting, inputting, and outputting operations. So before moving to that, so in an LSTM structure, you have two different variables which you store in your recurrent cell. The first is cell state, which is flowing in the top. And this is kind of representing your current cell state based on like whatever you have seen so far. You have accumulated that information and make some kind of judgment. Okay, so that's called cell state. And the other variable is this hidden state, which is passed from one time step to other. All right. So that's the cell state. Now, on your cell state, you can perform two kind of operations. So the first operation is from this forget layer. The second operation is from input layer. So the forget layer tells you if you need to forget something in your current cell state. All right. So it means that this is your memory. You are accumulating something, and at this time step, you looked at something, and after looking at that information, you decided, okay, now I have this extra piece of information, and therefore we don't need this piece of information in our current cell state. So you just get rid of that. Okay. And we'll see like how we can do that. So that's the first operation here. Then the second operation is you want to add something to your cell state. So what this essentially is doing, this is the input layer. So what it does is it looks at the input you're seeing at this current time step and makes some judgment. Okay, so this is the information I'm getting at this time step. So let's add. So this is very useful. Let's add this information to my current cell state, and that's what you're doing at this stage. So you add that information and update your cell state. Now that updated cell state is used to predict the output at this time step, and also which is like plays a role of a hidden state, the same information you send to your next time step. All right, so that's the role of the cell state. And now quickly look at like how these forget and this input layer works. So that was the forget gate. What it does is it look at the feedback information it's getting from the previous time step, this ht-1, and also looking at the information it's getting at the current time step. All right, so it combines both of them, makes some judgment, and decides, okay, that's what I had from the previous time step, that's what I have from the current time step. Now I think this information is redundant or it's useless. So let's remove that information from our current cell state. So that's the intuition behind this layer. And the way we do that is you take your hidden state information, current state information, just concat those two. And you have these weights. So this is a fully connected layer. So you perform this transformation. These are just biases. And based on this transformation, you will learn what to forget, what to keep. So what you do is you apply a sigmoid activation on this piece of information. So sigmoid, you remember, it transforms the activations between 0 and 1. So in the ideal scenario, what will happen is all the locations which you don't want to keep, you will make them 0, and all the information which you want to keep, you will make them 1. All right. So the output of this activation should be either 0 or 1. And that's the ideal case. Of course, that will not happen. You will get values between 0 and 1, but that's the ideal scenario. Now, if you think about that, that's your FT. And if you multiply that with your cell state, now what's happening here is wherever you have zeros, if you multiply that with your feature vector from cell state, you will just lose that information. And all the locations where you have 1, you will just keep that information. And that's how you are performing this forget operation. Okay. Now let's move on to the input gate. And again, the intuition here is you look at the feedback from the previous time step, you look at the information in the current time step, and you decide, okay, so this is the information which I should keep from this particular time step. And that's the operation which is being performed here. And the way to do that is, again, you concat these two. This is your fully connected layer. You perform this transformation, pass this to a sigmoid layer, this upper branch here, and this will make it either 0 and 1. And this tanh is trying to learn which information to keep or what kind of transformations I need to perform on this input before adding this to the cell state. Okay, so that transformation is being done here. And you're using a tanh activation. It means that your values will be between -1 and 1. So it's trying to kind of learn some useful features there. And when you multiply this CT with IT at this location, you're kind of filtering your learn features from this input, right? So this decides what features to keep and what features to not keep. Again, this is sigmoid, so that will be 0 or 1, 0 or 1. And based on that filtering, whatever values you have kept, you will directly add those to your cell state. So that's your input gate. Okay. Now you can update your cell state. This is the forget layer. This is the input layer where you add the values. This is a simple equation. Now let's come to the output. And again, in the output, what you're doing is you're trying to get the features back from your cell state using a tanh. And you're deciding based on your current input, what should be the output at this particular time step. Okay, again, the same operation, you perform a sigmoid on the concatenation of these two. It will make it 0 and 1. It's kind of selecting which features from the cell state should be sent as output at this particular time step and which should be omitted. And that's the operation being performed here. Okay. So again, these are simple equations. So if you combine all of these together, so this is your LSTM unit. And if you think about this, if you have to write a code for this, it's pretty simple, because all of these are like just matrix multiplication, and these are just activation functions, which are like point-wise activations. You apply those activations on each pixel values or each activation. So if you have to write a LSTM layer, these are the only 6 equations you will require. And even if you have to modify your LSTM cell and change the logic behind this, probably it might not be suitable for your application or your problem. Then you can look at these equations, and I think it's fairly easy to modify these. Okay, so question from Joel, are the activation functions here similar to the, so what is MUX? Joel, I'm not sure what do you, multiplexer. So the activations are like point-wise activations, right? So if you think about this, this is a feature vector, right? And you are only concatenating another feature vector. So again, this will be a flattened feature vector of some dimension, let's say D. And you're just normalizing each of those values between 0 and 1. So I'm not sure if you need a multiplexer for that. Yeah, I think that's interesting. So he's saying that in the sense that they control the flow based of that HT and XT. Yeah, I think that's a nice intuition, and you can think in that direction. It's kind of playing that role. Okay. Okay, so those are the equations, and as I said, I mean, it's not very difficult to modify this. But if you just have to use an LSTM layer, that's the only like single line of code you have to write. Of course, you'll have to import the library, and you just have to add a layer LSTM. This 128 is saying like what will be the width of your feature vector, the number of neurons you want, and that's it. This is going to implement all of this. Okay. Now, now, so that was LSTM, and there are many different variants of recurrent neural networks. So let's see how we can use that for activity classification. Now, what you can do is you can take your sequence of video frames and you can encode each of these frames using a CNN architecture. It could be any two-dimensional CNN architecture, right? And then pass to that those sequences or extracted features to an LSTM to make the prediction. So this is actually describing the same thing. So you have sequence of frames. Okay, so each frame you can extract the features using a CNN architecture. So that will be a flattened feature vector. And then for a video, you will have sequence of those feature vectors, which will be input to this LSTM cell here. And each LSTM cell will output like something at each time step. So what you can do is either you can just take the output from the final LSTM cell, that also works perfectly fine. Or what you can do is you can just take the average of all these predictions and use them for predicting what activity is happening or just classifying your video. So that's a simple use case how you can make use of LSTM. Now, so these LSTM, the architecture I explained, this is for fully connected layer, using fully connected layer here, right? You have these weights. But you can have another variant where instead of fully connected layers, you have convolution operation. And that's called a conv LSTM, right? So instead of this fully connected operation, you will have a convolution layer here, and you just replace all these layers with con operations. And the good thing about that is you don't have to extract like these CNN features from these images if you don't like that. So you can directly send in your images to your LSTM and ask your LSTM to perform that encoding. So if it's a conv LSTM, it can perform con operation. So then the input doesn't have to be a flattened feature vector. All right. But usually we don't do that. The reason is you don't want to make your recurrent cell too heavy. You want to extract the features externally so that these operations can be shared and the burden is not on the recurrent cell. Okay. But yeah, that's another variation which can be used. So instead of that, what we do is we extract features from these images, and instead of flattening those features, what we do is we preserve the spatial resolution of that activation map. And then instead of flattened feature vector, the input is a feature activation map which has some shape, right? And the good thing about that is it might happen that inside your LSTM you might want that spatial correlation to find or to extract some kind of information, right? So if you want to preserve that, then that's another variant which you can use. All right, so yeah, that's it for today's lecture. Any questions you have? So question from Joel, will today's lecture material be included in exam 2? Yes, it will be. So the answer is yes. So after this, I think we have just one lecture left, and we are going to talk about camera modeling. And that's like a very classical view of computer vision, and I think that's pretty interesting. The reason I kept that for the last lecture is uh, it would have been very hard to correlate that with like all the other lectures which we have covered so far. So it's kind of a separate piece, but I think it will be very useful for you if you're interested in computer vision. And so another question from Saeed: for the project report, is there a page requirement? So you mean like the page limit? I mean, ideally, I think you should try to write maybe a 4 or 5 pages, or that should be fine. So don't make it too short, like a couple of pages, and don't make it too long, like 20 or 30 pages. It will be hard to read. But I mean, you can go above that limit, somewhat below that limit. That's perfectly fine. So 5 to 6 pages, I think, will be optimal. Okay. Question from Jiangtai: do we have a review section before the final? What do you mean by review section? You mean like a lecture, or? So next Thursday it's a holiday, right? And your midterm is on I think third, next Tuesday. So we don't have any lecture in between. I think the only thing you can do is, if you have any questions, if you have any doubts, I think I will encourage you to write me an email and also copy Ayush. And I think we can try to arrange like extra office hours on maybe Monday or Tuesday if there's any such need. Okay, but just let us know in advance, because if you write an email like at the last moment, then it will be difficult to accommodate that. Okay.